The photograph had survived war, fire, and neglect, tucked inside a thin brown folder marked with a fading stamp from 1944. At first glance, it showed nothing remarkable. A young pilot seated in his aircraft, goggles resting on his helmet, one gloved hand near the controls. The sky behind him was pale and empty, the kind of sky that promised nothing and took everything. It was the sort of image archivists flipped past without pause, a frozen second among millions stolen by history. Only when the scan finished rendering did the silence in the room change. The analyst leaned closer, drawn by a subtle wrongness that couldn't be explained. The cockpit glass reflected more than it should have. Not clouds, not sunlight, but a shape pressed too near, too aware. The closer the zoom crept, the clearer it became that the pilot's eyes were not focused on the horizon. They were fixed on something inside the plane, something the original photographer could never have seen. Flight records said the man flew alone. Mission logs confirmed it. Crew manifests were clean. Yet the reflection showed depth where there should have been emptiness, a suggestion of form that did not match metal, fabric, or human anatomy. It looked as though the photograph had captured a witness rather than a subject. The analyst felt the uneasy certainty that the pilot had known. That, in the instant the shutter clicked, he understood something had followed him into the air, something that could not be shaken loose by altitude or speed. And now, decades later, the photograph was doing what it had been waiting to do all along, inviting someone else to see it too. The photograph's return began quietly, without ceremony, as most unsettling things do. It surfaced during the digitization of a neglected military archive, a storage facility filled with metal cabinets that still smelled faintly of oil, dust, and damp paper. Thousands of photographs had been boxed there since the end of the war, many of them untouched for decades, their labels typed by clerks who never imagined a future where images could be magnified beyond the limits of the naked eye. The 1944 pilot's photo was one of these, filed under routine reconnaissance documentation, stamped as cleared and unremarkable, its contents already deemed harmless by history. The analyst assigned to the project was not searching for secrets, only consistency. The task was mechanical scan, catalog, enhance for clarity, upload. Most images revealed the same predictable details: runways scarred by use, pilots posing stiffly beside aircraft, blurred aerial shots of landscapes that no longer existed. The pilot's photograph fit neatly into this pattern at first glance. A single airman seated in his plane, uniform neat, expression unreadable, framed as if meant only to prove that the mission had occurred. What made the analyst pause was not drama, but absence. Something about the image felt unfinished, as though it had been captured too early or too late. The lighting was flat, the background empty, the composition oddly intimate for a military record. It was the kind of photo taken quickly, without thought, and precisely because of that, it carried no intention to deceive. Those were the images the analyst trusted least. Curiosity led to a decision that broke routine. Instead of performing a standard scan, the analyst adjusted the settings, pushing the resolution far beyond what the archive required. The machine hummed longer than usual, processing information that had never been extracted before. Grain sharpened into texture, reflections into surfaces, shadows into layered depths. Details long crushed by time and paper slowly emerged, pixel by pixel, as though the photograph itself were resisting exposure. The file opened on the screen, larger than life, and the room seemed to contract around it. What had once been a simple cockpit now revealed subtle distortions in the glass, faint patterns of light bending in ways that suggested more than sky and metal. The analyst leaned closer, aware of a tightening behind the eyes, a sensation that came not from fear, but from recognition. The feeling that something ordinary had been mistaken for something simple. This was not discovery in the dramatic sense, not yet. It was the first quiet fracture in certainty. The moment when a forgotten image refused to remain forgotten. When a photograph taken to document a routine mission hinted that it had been preserving something else entirely, waiting decades for the right tools and the wrong pair of eyes to finally notice the disturbance announced itself slowly, almost politely, as if the photograph were allowing time to adjust before revealing what should never have been there. At higher magnification, the cockpit glass ceased to behave like glass. Light did not simply reflect or pass through. It bent inward, folding upon itself in a way that suggested depth where none should exist. The analyst assumed at first that it was a scanning artifact, a trick of aging film, or a flaw introduced by moisture and time. Those explanations were familiar, comforting, and easily dismissed with experience. Yet the more the image was enlarged, the more deliberate the anomaly became. Within the reflection, behind the pilot's rigid outline, appeared a darker presence, not sharply defined but unmistakably structured. It was positioned too close to the pilot's shoulder, occupying a space that the cockpit's dimensions could not physically allow. The reflection obeyed no known geometry. Its angles contradicted the aircraft's layout, and its placement ignored the laws of perspective that governed every other surface in the frame. The analyst cross-referenced the photograph with technical schematics of the aircraft model, tracing interior measurements and comparing them against the reflection's apparent scale. The numbers refused to align, even accounting for distortion. There was no configuration in which such a form could exist inside the cockpit without being directly visible to the camera. And yet there it was, nested in the glass like a memory trapped between layers of time. More unsettling still was the pilot's expression. At normal resolution, his face appeared neutral, perhaps tired. Zoomed in, his eyes told a different story. They were not focused ahead, as training dictated, but angled slightly inward, toward the same region where the reflection gathered its impossible depth. His jaw was clenched, not in concentration, but in restraint, as though reacting would acknowledge something he could not afford to confront. The analyst examined mission logs, crew records, and flight rosters, expecting some overlooked detail that could anchor the image back to reality. There was none. The pilot had flown alone. No co-pilot, no instructor, no observer. The cockpit was designed for a single occupant, and the official records had been reviewed multiple times since the war. The reflection's presence contradicted not only physical space, but documented fact. As the realization settled, a deeper unease took hold. This was not a random distortion or a coincidental shape conjured by shadow and grain. It had intention, alignment, and placement, as if it were aware of being captured. The photograph had not simply recorded a pilot in 1944, it had recorded an intrusion, a moment where something unaccounted for had entered the frame and remained there, preserved with unsettling clarity, waiting for technology and attention to finally reveal it. The deeper the analyst pursued the pilot's history, the more the past began to resist examination. Official records were intact on the surface, neatly typed and carefully stamped. But their consistency felt manufactured, as if they had been revised to agree with one another, rather than to reflect events as they occurred. Dates aligned too perfectly, language repeated itself across separate reports, and entire paragraphs appeared copied, adjusted only by name and location. It was the subtle sameness that raised concern, the sense that too many hands had corrected the same story. The pilot's final mission stood out immediately. According to the log, it was a routine reconnaissance flight over an area already heavily surveyed. assigned without urgency and completed without incident. Yet there was no corresponding landing report, no maintenance record for the aircraft afterward, and no debrief transcript. The mission ended on paper and nowhere else. When the analysts searched for the crash report that should have followed, there was only a brief addendum noting loss of contact due to weather interference, followed by an abrupt closure of the file. Names began to vanish the further back the analyst traced the chain of documentation. Supervising officers listed on earlier drafts were missing from later versions. Ground crew signatures faded into initials, then into blank spaces. A squadron that should have generated dozens of related photographs had only 3 surviving images, all of them oddly framed, all taken within the same hour. The pattern suggested removal rather than loss, a careful thinning of evidence that left just enough behind to appear complete. The analyst reached beyond the official archive, accessing personal letters, base newspapers, and secondary accounts that had never been fully indexed. There were mentions of the pilot there, brief and vague, comments about his demeanor changing in the weeks before his last flight. One letter described him as distracted, prone to staring at empty corners of rooms, as though listening for something that never arrived. Another noted that he had requested reassignment more than once, citing reasons that were redacted in later copies. Even the supposed crash site refused to resolve into certainty. Coordinates conflicted depending on the source, shifting by miles between documents. Search and rescue reports referenced terrain features that did not exist in the recorded area. No wreckage was ever conclusively identified, yet the case was closed with unusual speed. It was as if the disappearance itself had been the acceptable outcome, preferable to whatever explanation might have followed a full investigation. By the time the analyst returned to the photograph, it no longer felt like an isolated anomaly. It felt like the remaining fragment of a larger erasure, a single image that had slipped through the process intact. The disturbing detail in the reflection was no longer the question, but the answer that official history had worked meticulously to avoid, leaving behind a trail of silence, omissions, and contradictions that pointed to a truth someone had decided should never fully surface. The photograph did not behave consistently once it was shared. At first, the analyst assumed any discomfort stemmed from suggestion, the natural consequence of staring too long at an unsettling image. But when a second researcher reviewed the file independently, their reaction followed an eerily similar path. They paused at the same magnification level, leaned closer to the screen in the same way, and asked the same quiet question about the cockpit glass before being told anything about the anomaly. What they described seeing matched in shape and placement, yet differed subtly in detail, as though the reflection had adjusted itself to the observer. As more eyes examined the image, the variations became impossible to ignore. One technician claimed the reflected presence appeared closer to the pilot's face, its outline sharper, almost attentive. Another insisted it seemed partially obscured, as if receding into the depth of the glass. A historian reviewing a printed enlargement later reported seeing a suggestion of movement, not captured motion, but the implication of it, like a figure caught mid-shift between moments. Each account contradicted the others in specifics while aligning perfectly in intent. Stranger still were the after-effects. Several viewers mentioned an unshakable sense of being watched long after they stepped away from the screen. One researcher reported recurring dreams in which the photograph appeared unchanged, yet felt heavier each time, as though accumulating weight. Another refused to continue working on the project after experiencing a sudden nosebleed while examining the image, dismissing it publicly as stress while privately requesting reassignment. No physical explanation connected these incidents, but their timing did. Attempts to lock the image into a single state failed. Screenshots taken seconds apart revealed slight differences in contrast and depth that could not be attributed to compression or display variance. Printed copies looked subtly altered when compared side by side, even when produced from the same file. The photograph seemed to resist being fixed, responding instead to attention to the act of observation itself. It was as though the image contained more information than could be rendered all at once, revealing only what each viewer was capable of perceiving. The analyst began to notice changes personally. Details that had once required careful zooming now stood out immediately, as if the image were meeting the gaze halfway. The sense of distance between observer and photograph diminished, replaced by an unsettling intimacy. The pilot's eyes appeared more alert, the reflection more deliberate. It no longer felt like a document from the past, but like an interaction unfolding in real time. The realization crept in slowly and without relief. This was not a static artifact being interpreted differently by different minds. The photograph itself was participating, altering its presentation with each new witness, as though acknowledging their presence and responding in kind, transforming the simple act of viewing into something reciprocal, something that did not end when the screen went dark. The final understanding arrived not as a revelation, but as a convergence of patterns the analyst could no longer separate. Every interaction with the photograph followed the same trajectory: initial curiosity, rising unease, then a subtle sense of obligation, as though the image demanded continued attention. It became clear that those who disengaged quickly felt relief, while those who lingered were drawn deeper, experiencing sharper details, stronger impressions, and a growing conviction that the photograph was incomplete without them. The image was not changing at random, it was advancing toward something. Late one night, alone in the archive, the analyst returned to the original scan, stripping away enhancements and overlays, viewing it in its rawest form. What remained was not emptier, but fuller, as though the photograph had been waiting for this moment of direct confrontation. The reflection in the cockpit glass no longer appeared merely adjacent to the pilot. It aligned with him, occupying the same visual plane, suggesting not a separate presence but a convergence, a moment where two states briefly overlapped. The analyst revisited the pilot's final mission with this new perspective. The absence of wreckage, the altered reports, the erased names all pointed to a conclusion that felt both impossible and inevitable. The pilot had not simply disappeared. He had been caught in the act of witnessing something he could not escape. The photograph had preserved that instant, not as evidence of a crash or an enemy encounter, but as a record of transition. The precise moment when the pilot realized he was no longer alone in his own body or his own space. What the analyst finally understood was that the photograph functioned less like an image and more like a threshold. It did not trap a creature or a ghost in the conventional sense. It held a moment open, sustained by attention, unfinished and unresolved. Each viewer did not merely observe the past, but stepped closer to it, reinforcing the connection that had first been established in 1944. The disturbing detail was not meant to be identified or named, because naming it would close the gap the photograph depended on. The pilot's gaze, once seen this way, felt directed outward rather than inward. He was not looking at the reflection but through it, toward whoever would eventually find the image and look long enough to see what he had seen. The photograph was not asking to be explained or exposed. It was waiting to be completed, to pass on what it contained to the next witness willing to acknowledge it. The analyst shut down the workstation, fully aware that the act of understanding had already fulfilled the photograph's purpose, and that somewhere within the preserved grain and distorted glass, the moment had shifted again, subtly, permanently, carrying the weight of one more observer into the still, unfinished past